Hi, this is James Tanner, and I'm here in the Brigham Young University Family History Library, and we are starting a new series of webinars. And this particular webinar is entitled, Why You Can't Trace Your Ancestry Back to Adam. First of all, we need to understand that family history relies on records. That seems to be kind of an obvious conclusion, but we have to think about the consequences of the fact that if we have no records, we have no history. There really isn't a way to go back outside of whatever has been preserved. Archaeologists, of course, can go back thousands of years into history and look at the physical remains of various civilizations and people. Genealogists, however, have to completely rely on written records. There's not a whole lot we can do to reconstruct the genealogy of a family from their baskets, or their pottery, unless they happen to write on their pottery, which was helpful. But the reality is that if there are no records, we have no history to research, and we're basically without any way to go back. Now, another point that's kind of derives from that first one is that there are always temporal limits to all records. So no matter where you go around the world, you're always going to find that there are some records that you can't they can't be found after a period of time in the past. I'm going to illustrate that sort of by going across a certain number of records. For example, what are the earliest records that we find for Arizona? Now, I chose Arizona not only because that's where I primarily lived, but it is also because it's what was known as the baby state. It was the last of the 48 contiguous states that was admitted to the Union. So it has the most recent beginning for its records as far as a state in the United States is concerned. The earliest records, by the way, from Arizona date back to the early Spanish exploration, which began in the 1500s, long before there was a United States of America. And the earliest European settlements, which were Spanish settlements from the Spanish Empire, began in 1687. So we actually have records in Arizona that date back on church records from the 1770s, long before the United States was ever interested in a place called Arizona, and before there were people here in the western part of the United States. So effectively, what that means is that any records for Arizona are gone, even though your family spoke Spanish and lived in Arizona before it became a state. Those records are now not available. There aren't any. They just had no records kept. So we have an absolute limit going back to around 1770 for any records in Arizona. And the practical reality of it is that there are very few records for anyone who came across the country to Arizona, other than the Spanish people with Spanish heritage, who before 1850. So it's a relatively recent area. My comment was always, I don't really ever do genealogy for Arizona because either you came from someplace else and settled there, and so we're not interested in the records in Arizona. But if you did come to Arizona and your people were there in the early years before 1900, everyone I ever met could list every one of the people that arrived in Arizona. So they all knew who their ancestors were. So even though we had some rather extensive collections of genealogical records for Arizona, I only found that it was necessary if the people were teenagers and coming in, because they didn't know who their grandparents were. So beyond that, there's very little information. But another point, The largest county in Arizona is, population-wise, not size-wise, is Maricopa County. It's kind of an interesting sidelight. The population of Maricopa County is actually greater than the entire state of Utah, just in case you wanted to know. In fact, Maricopa County has a greater population than 23 states. So there's a lot of people there in Maricopa County. So we can count on the fact that they are probably interested in something about their history. Maricopa County was formed in 1871. What that means is before 1871, there are no records for Maricopa County because there was no Maricopa County in existence. Okay, so it's kind of a simple process here. If we go back historically, looking at these records, we'll see that the counties, as we go across the United States, all have dates in which they were formed. This is when the first people came to the county. Okay, so the next thing that happens is that there are no records in Maricopa County before that date. Now, what about Utah records, for example? We move up a little bit to the north. One thing that every little school child in Utah learns is that the pioneers arrived in 1847. We have days of 47, parades. We have all sorts of things about the original pioneers. What does that mean? It means there's no records before 1847. That's when they got here, and that's when they started keeping records. So if you have a record of somebody who lived, if you have someone in your family who lived before 1847, they were not likely born in Utah, and even if they were, they probably had no record of it. So that's kind of the limiting factor of how you get back and find these various records. Now, the point is, for every state and county in the United States, there's a point in time when the first records were kept. Many people in our country have what we call Native American ancestors. They go back to the early inhabitants of America that were there before the Europeans arrived. The good news is that's true. The bad news is we're not aware of any significant genealogical records that record any of these people. So our records of genealogical importance start with the Europeans coming to America. Okay, so now what we're going to do is trying to figure out what are the earliest written records in America. Okay, so now we're worried about that, and the idea here is where did they come from? How did they get here, and when did they start writing things down? So we need to know a little bit of history. And probably the oldest records in America are those kept in St. Augustine, Florida, beginning around 1513, so pretty early. There are some records, by the way, on FamilySearch.org in their catalog that are the records of the Diocese of Louisiana and the Floridas at the University of Notre Dame archives, and they begin in 1513 and go to 1803. So if your ancestors happen to be some of those few people who lived in the southern part of what's now the United States and spoke Spanish, or perhaps even French, they might be in these records of those early Catholic Church records in the southern part of the United States. Well, what about English records? Well, we had English-speaking people who showed up in America pretty early, so we wanted to know a little bit about their records. So let's go to the English records in England. Where did these people who came over here come from? Well, they were the English records that they have in England. Every county in England, all of those colored things, and Wales and Scotland and Ireland and Northern and Southern Ireland and and Ireland and Northern Ireland and all the other places all have time limits. So the earliest parish registers in England go back to about 1538. Why do I say that? Well, that's because We have some reference books that show us and keep up to date, and where people have gone through and listed exhaustively every county, gone through every record that's available, and given us a list in actually in book form, but now they're also digitized form, of the origin of every single county in England. So every parish of every county has a beginning date for their records. Now, the significance of that is that it was only with church records, the parish records, that we had a record of individuals with their birth and death records. And the one that we refer to most frequently is called Great Britain Atlas and Index of Parish Registers. It was also known as Phillimor's, Phillimor apostrophe S, Phillimor's Atlas, and it's been updated and kept up to date, and we have current copies of it in paper form here in our reference section of our library here in the Family History Library here at BYU. But if you zoom in on that, you can see the individual counties, and each of those counties has a date. Excuse me, you have the individual counties, you zoom in and see the individual parishes, and each parish has a date, and that parish date is the date that so far they've been able to find the earliest record in existence for that parish. So you have, and that's maps of the entire country of England, and as you go through you can look and find exactly when the earliest records. Now, why is that important? As you're going back and tracing your genealogy back, and you find that you've traced it back to England, and then you can find the parish where they lived, and then you begin tracing that back, at some point you're running out of records. There are simply no more records. Now, whenever I say that, someone always says to me, well, what about probate records? And I say, yeah, except my ancestors were the property that was being probated. They weren't the people doing the probate. They were owned. And most of the people in England in those early days were not royalty, were not wealthy landowners. They were tenant farmers. They were serfs, however you want to denominate them that is politically correct for your particular view of the world. They were people who did not own the property that they were living on and were living there at the good graces of whoever owned the property. Another problem that they had at the time was they couldn't move. Once they were born in a place, they had to stay there because there was no place else they could go. And if they left, they would probably arrest them and ship them back. So that was kind of the reality of life back then. So most of people that we deal with in a genealogical sense date back to clusters, areas, smaller geographic areas where these people lived at the time where they began to originate, as far as our records are concerned. Now, you may be a descendant of many, many, many different clusters of people, and at each line that you go back, and it may develop several different clusters of where they originated. So the challenge of genealogy is making these connections between the various clusters. How did this person marry this person? How did they, when they weren't really related? Today, that's a little bit different. I mean, obviously, you could have a long-distance trucker who lived in Michigan who met his wife at a truck stop in Arizona, and they got married in Nevada. That's no big deal. Everybody has somebody like that in their family. But back in those days, as we go back in time, that not only became unusual, but unless these people were royalty or very wealthy people, they probably didn't have the ability to marry anyone outside of their parish or their circle of parishes. Now, these parishes are very small. When we look at this area here, most of those parishes are no more than about 10 or 15 miles across total. Some of them much smaller than that. Okay, so the reason why I mentioned the 1538 date is that's when King Henry VIII ordered the records to be kept. As King of England, he had separated himself from the Catholic Church, and begun the process of establishing a Church of England. And as a result of that, he ordered the people to handle the parish records. Now, why am I getting my thing going backwards of its own accord? But anyway, okay, so the next thing we want to know is where are the earliest Catholic Church records? Okay, so now we've talked about the earliest records in the United States. By the way, I didn't mention the United States, but the United States did not begin, by the way, in 1776, when everybody talks about the Declaration of Independence. We happened to fight a war that lasted for a few years before anybody recognized that there was a place called the United States of America. And the official date of the beginning of the United States is 1783. Well, actually, the Constitution was signed in 1782, so that's a common date. But the real date is 1783, when the treaty was signed, and internationally the United States was recognized as a country. So what we have in the United States is records that go back to 1783, folks. Before that, it was England. So we have to realize that we are going to be back into English records very quickly here. Another question is, well, what about the first settlers who came to America? Well, they were English and French and Spanish and Russian and maybe a few other countries, Dutch. And what happened is their records were kept by their countries. And in Mexico, for example, which was part of the Spanish Empire, all of the records were required to be kept in triplicate. One copy stayed with the parish, with the church. One copy was sent to Mexico City, and one copy was put on a boat and sent over to Seville in Spain, to the archives. And so today, by the way, if you happen to have Spanish ancestors, you can go to the National Archive, the Spanish archives, called the Indian Archives in Seville. And obviously you'd have to speak Spanish in order to find all this, but they're digitizing all of those early records from the Spanish Empire. So you can find your ancestors if they lived in Panama or Mexico or Peru or Argentina. You may find them in the archives in Seville. Okay, so now where were the earliest Catholic records? They began in around 1497 in Spain. That's a good cutoff date, and that means Europe. We're not just talking about Spain here. This is the Catholic records, and these are the earliest Catholic records. And there are some isolated records that go back into the 900s. They go back almost 500 more years. But those are very unusual records and not something, and it'd just be a chance, probably, if your ancestors happen to be in some of those places where the records go back further. Okay, so now there are older records. Obviously, 1497 is late enough that there were a lot of records. People talk about medieval records and everything. There were older records, but the problem with those is, first of all, they weren't consistently available. Secondly, they're very hard to read scripts. And they're in Old Latin, and they're in Latin or old forms of the modern languages. The further back you go, the more likely you're going to be into things like Middle English, Old Slavonic, Old Church Slavonic, Middle German, Old German, all of the old languages. So the challenge you have in doing research back is that not only are you're going to either have to copy records, or you're going to have to start to learn all this information. You're going to have to learn how to read the records, and you're going to have to learn how to decipher the languages. And the records, by the way, don't record individuals as such. And if they're not either, unless they are either rich or royalty. So the key here is tying your lines into a royal line, because that's where you're going to find a record if you go back any further. Now, I just wanted to give you, now some of these slides are a little bit off. We're still doing some testing here on this process, so we're going to have to decide how we're going to figure that out. Here is an example of what we call Carolinian script. That was popular in Europe from 800 to 1200 AD. Most of the records you find before 1200 AD are going to be in Carolinian, and if you look at it, that's what it looks like. And that's what the language. And if you are looking at this and you're saying, oh yeah, I can read that, then you probably are going to be one of the people that will be able to do some work back before 1550. But if you can't read that, then that's what you've got to understand. That's where all your documents are going to look like. They're not going to be a newspaper form. You're not going to have dictionaries or anything to tell you what it is. You're going to have to figure all this stuff out. Okay. If you go back even further, and we go back to 800 AD, what you're going to have to learn is called uncial. And uncial goes back as far as anything, and that's what uncial looks like. Can you pick out the names there? Probably not. Okay. So it realistically, when someone comes to me and say, I have my ancestry and we've taken it all the way back to Adam, and I say, oh, can I use you if I have some documents in uncial? Will you read those for me? And they go, what are you talking about? And I go, well, okay, I now don't believe a word you're saying to me. Basically, once when I was working in the Family History Library in Mesa, Arizona, someone started to present us with some records that were in Norway that went back into the 800s and the 600s. And we challenged them and said, wait a minute. You're bringing in all these records from the Old Norse and from the 800s. And basically they came back and said, yeah. And what we're doing is we're coordinating these with the Middle Eastern section up in Salt Lake City at Family Search. And all the research that we're doing, because we're qualified to do that research, all of the research that we're doing is going up there, and they're double checking it against all the medieval records and the early Norse records that they have there to make sure that we're actually doing work that's hasn't been done before. It was interesting. They really were actual people who were doing this work. Now, when you start copying, you stop doing genealogy. So when you pull out a book that has a royal line, or you pull out a book that tells you what your genealogy is, you've stopped doing research, folks. I'm sorry. That's, it's not saying that there aren't books that we can use as references, but you're then relying on that line and those people to supply you with information about what you're looking at. You're not looking at original documents. They're derivative. If they have the sources, then you can go back and check the source to make sure that you've got some information that's correct. But when we get this far back in European history, most of what we find is highly suspect. Very little of the information is accurate. There's people that have spent their entire lives. We have organizations out there whose entire function is to catalog and verify and validate pedigrees and information about people who lived in the Middle Ages. There are a number of websites, Middle Age websites. Well, yeah, most of us are in Middle Age, but they're in the medieval times, and they are. There are some official people who do this as professionally to validate the various lines. A lot of that information is available and has been available through Family Search. We actually have a FamilySearch.org a section called Community Trees that contains uh, thousands of compiled names of information from the royal lines and all of these people going back. So let's say you're looking back and you say, well, I want to be connected to some king or queen or something back in history. So what about the royal lines? Um, very few of these lines that you read in popular books and things are verified. Uh, Most of the people that I run across, when you start clicking back on their pedigree or looking at their pedigree charts that tie into royal lines, have done the research that's necessary to verify that connection. It's just, that's just the fact. Um, there are some, and every time I present on this subject or talk about it or write about it, someone will always come back with a comment that says, yeah, but I did all the work necessary to prove this. And my answer is fine. You did all the work necessary to prove it. Now, how much of that do you believe that you just connected with? And there's a recent thing that just came up, by the way, that's kind of interesting, because one of the there's an attorney here in Utah who is challenging the award of a dukedom in England, and on the basis of DNA research that he's done that shows that he is the rightful heir to that particular dukedom in England, and that the person who was given it wrong because they didn't recognize the true heir at the time for political reasons. They ignored the true heir, and the true heir's descendants are now coming back to haunt the British royalty. But the interesting thing about it is that the conclusion of the article, which was in a British newspaper recently, is that Queen Elizabeth's claim to the British throne is really in question here, because if they go back with the DNA, they find out that she really wasn't the descendant of all of those people that they were supposed to be descendant of. So we have some really interesting things that are happening about royal lines right now in our current history. Okay, so what about these lines? Well, first of all, the whole idea here is that there's a lot of this that's been verified. In other words, verified as much as it's possible to verify. And in order to get back into the royal lines, so these are the people who have gotten their genealogy back to 1500s and or before that, and they feel that they're connected to a royal line. So they want to be, they want to be able to have it heraldry and have your coat of arms and all that stuff. Well, first of all, people who put coat of arms on their current websites are generally people who don't know enough to know what they're even doing. Coats of arms are hereditary, but they're also a political thing that you have to go through the royal heraldry people over in England to have them grant you a coat of arms before you're actually officially that. You can get anybody to draw up a coat of arms and sell it to you, and they did that wholesale during the 1800s and the early 1900s. So I have a book, one of my Tanner surname books, written back in the 1940s, starts out with a picture of the coat of arms for the Tanner family. There's only one problem, is that the Tanner family has never been traced back to England yet. So I don't know how we get a coat of arms when we can't get off the Rhode Island shore and get to England. But assuming that guy was royal, the guy that came over to Rhode Island, I doubt that. But most of the theories was that he was transported from England, meaning he was arrested and put on a ship and sent to America. But even if that wasn't the case, what you have to do in order to connect to one of these royal lines is to have a gateway ancestor. A gateway ancestor is someone who has a proven connection to the royalty. And in New England, for instance, in the United States, there are certain very specific books acceptable, which have been verified and are accepted by most of the scholars, that list all the gateway ancestors. So if you can trace your ancestry back to New England and you find your name in this book, your person is listed in this book, you are in there. In other words, you have a right to, I guess, copy that whole thing into that whole royal line into Ancestry or Family Search. Please do not put it in Family Search. We don't need it. we basically have all that in there, by the way. A gateway ancestor is an individual who has a traceable or known ancestry in a specific group, in this case, New England, who intermarries into a target group, meaning the descendants in the United States, and therefore adds a new set of ancestors to her descendants in the target group. So when you get into this, you have this opportunity, if you want to call it that, of going back and connecting to the royalty and we're going to say in Europe in general, because most of the royalty in Europe was related to each other. We talk about the English kings. Well, most of the English kings were German or Spanish or Austrian or something else. They weren't really English at all. And then from 1066, a lot of them were French. So they had all their relatives and cousins were all over the place in Europe. Okay, so these are the ones, but the Colonial American Gateway Ancestors, from our standpoint here in the United States, are the ones that are the best known and the most documented. And they are people, and they're defined as colonial immigrants with a large American posterity and proven connections to early European royalty, and they have to have been born prior to 1800 and been an immigrant to America. So there's, like I said, these are all listed and documented and verified. Now we get back to the real question. How reliable are these royal lines? How far back can we go with these lines? And the answer, the senior royalty research specialist for the LDS Church, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, genealogical department back in 1984 wrote an article in the Church's magazine called The Ensign that says that by assignment, I've reviewed hundreds of pedigrees over the years. I have not found one where each connection on the pedigree can be justified by evidence from contemporary documents. There's the answer. In my opinion, it's not even possible to verify historically a connected European pedigree earlier than the time of the Merovingian kings. That's from 450 AD to 752 AD. That's it, folks. That's the official word on the earliest valid connections. Now, we're also going to have people come flying in with DNA claims and all sorts of things. I don't think that the fact that you show that you are 2 or 3% Neanderthal blood adds anything to your pedigree. Perhaps you think that's important, but I think it's kind of outside the pale of genealogy when we get into that kind of thing. And by the way, I've been reading reports of people who apparently have that show up in their DNA testing. Okay, so here's the rule of thumb. This is kind of the guideline that you would go by for how all this stuff works in reality, meaning the average person looking out at their genealogy who is not a medieval scholar, does not speak Latin fluently, and cannot read all those old scripts. The rule is there are very, very few reliable pedigrees back before 1550. That's the reality of it. Once you get to 1550, in Europe, you are done. Now, if you're Chinese or Japanese or one of the other Asian countries, Korean, it is very possible that your pedigree has been preserved in a family book that goes back thousands of years, even back before into antiquity. So, and those are apparently very reliable pedigrees. So, but we're talking about the majority of the people in the Western Hemisphere, people from Europe, their pedigrees do not go back. And obviously, if you're tracing a Chinese pedigree, you're in a different world, in a different set of historical circumstances than we are here with European ancestors. So the question that we can ask ourselves is, apart from any social considerations, religious considerations, or anything else, can we do, and I'm not questioning the accuracy of the biblical record. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it or anything. I'm just saying, can we trace our ancestry back to Adam? The answer is, you're back to 1550, and that's a long way. That's 1500 years that you've got to cover in a gap. And the answer to that is no. You simply have no, we simply have no records that will accurately tie us back. Then the question is, well, what about all the lists, the family trees, and all the charts we can buy and acquire and work with? So now what we are into is something else, and that is pure fantasy. Okay.